This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. So I had a good weekend, drove across the state to go celebrate a friend's birthday, and we managed to get a few days ice fishing in on a few different lakes, and largely got our butts kicked. This photo pretty much sums up our time out there. Didn't do too hot. I'm no Michael Parenti, so we better check in with him and see how he fared in the realm of fishing this week.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Fishing Corner, episode 31. Here we are, February 16th, 2023. I went to a beautiful river this past weekend on the jet boat, took Cassie out, and we almost got skunked. We were out swinging flies, trying to catch some big trouts, and wound up catching one in the bottom of the ninth. And this fish, I've never seen this before, is like spitting out moss as it's being released. And the only thing that comes to my mind is that it's probably spitting up that moss because it was probably full of scuds or aquatic insects. So kind of a cool clip. I wound up going fishing again on Sunday and Monday, just doing the local nymphing deal, and it was actually pretty good. So a couple little brown trout, a couple nice brown trout, a couple fish here or there. Nothing really too exciting, but yeah, it was a good time. Hey, what can you say? Getting out after work, always a fun time. So I don't really have big plans for this weekend. It's supposed to be kind of cold. I'm sure I'll get out, and I'm sure I'll be telling you about it next week. Thanks for your time. It's been great talking to you guys, and I really hope that you enjoy the upcoming segments here on Fresh Tracks Weekly. Back to you, Marcus.
For news this week, keeping with the fishing theme, in Montana, environmental groups have officially filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with the goal of putting Arctic Grayling on the endangered species list within the upper Missouri River watershed. Grayling are a native fish species that used to occupy much of the rivers and streams within Montana, but they're now relegated to a few small streams and rivers at the very upstream portions of the watershed. We've filmed fishing for grayling in the past in a few lakes in Montana. These populations are largely separate from those occupying the rivers and streams, but they can be source populations for reintroductions. We actually made a video on this in the past with fisheries biologist Mike Duncan, where he was collecting genetic samples from lake populations to help inform which sources are best for these reintroductions. But anyway, back to that lawsuit. This is nothing new in terms of environmental groups trying to sue the Fish and Wildlife Service. There's been a back and forth battle over grayling in the state for 30 years. In 1994, the Center for Biological Diversity petitioned for the listing of grayling, and Fish and Wildlife Service said they were indeed warranted for ESA protection, but because of a number of factors, the actual listing was delayed for years. In the meantime, though, a cooperative effort was forming to incentivize landowners within the upper Big Hole Valley watershed, which is one of those stretches where the last native populations remain. But these landowners were incentivized to manage their land and water rights in a way to reduce threats to the fish. Basically, if landowners agreed to manage their property in a way that improved stream flow, improved riparian areas, remove barriers, reduce any threats, and agree to these annual compliance checks, then they would be provided with assurances against regulatory requirements if grayling were to become listed. So this was a proactive approach to keep more water in the river and improve grayling habitat before the listing happened. And they have since completed hundreds of projects and have 80% of the landowners signed on to this agreement. So by the time that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service finally got around to making a decision in 2014, they decided that listing grayling wasn't necessary due to all of the efforts and showing that grayling populations had actually grown in some areas. Because of this decision, environmental groups sued, but they lost. Again, Fish and Wildlife Service said the listing wasn't warranted in 2020, and that's the current decision we're at that's being litigated. It's a never-ending saga. I think this quote from former executive director of Trout Unlimited, Bruce Farling, sums it up well. Quote, "The grayling population in the Big Hole is by all technical applications of the ESA definitely eligible to be listed. There's just not that many of them. The problem is I'm not sure the ESA listing buys anything except a lot of heartburn and a bunch of pissed off people." End quote. In Idaho, they recently released the results of their chronic wasting disease tests for the 2022 season. Out of the over 3,000 samples, only 15 came back positive, and they were all detected within the same 6-mile radius. CWD was first detected in Idaho in 2021 in this same area, and they are hopeful that early detection within a relatively confined area will allow for an opportunity to manage the herd, reducing their numbers. It has been documented in other states that once CWD becomes established and prevalence rates are high, that it is nearly impossible to control. but there has been a huge effort to try to detect it as early as possible as it moves into new areas. I did try to look this up quickly if there's any success stories of finding CWD early, getting it in those early stages and getting it stopped. I couldn't find any examples of it happening. Maybe it has. If so, let me know. It will be interesting to see if they can contain it, as we've watched detection spread fairly rapidly through other states. But in those scenarios where it's rapidly spreading, the CWD could have very well been there longer than we realized, and it's only increased with increased sampling efforts. Hopefully, Idaho caught it in time. Time will tell. We will see. In Montana, keeping with the disease theme, 149 elk were recently captured in the Pioneer Mountains and were tested for brucellosis. All of the tests came back negative. In Montana anyway, brucellosis is a disease that primarily affects elk, cattle, and bison. The reason it's such a concern in the state is because the Department of Livestock has placed strict guidelines within certain areas and imposed severe consequences to livestock producers if one of their cows tests positive for brucellosis. The Montana Department of Livestock has also designated a surveillance area within the state, within which any cattle or domestic bison that are going to be moved or sold must be tested for brucellosis. Right now, the designated surveillance area is just a portion of southwest Montana around Yellowstone. Just within this area, which contains less than 5% of Montana's cattle, the state spends about $1 million a year to reimburse ranchers or veterinarians for testing. If brucellosis were to become more prevalent in livestock, the whole state would have to test, costing millions of dollars. One of the concerns is from elk and bison transmitting brucellosis to cattle, and that's why the testing was recently done on the elk and part of the effort to determine if the designated surveillance area needs to be expanded. So for this year at least, there was no new positives in that periphery around the designated surveillance area, so the boundary remains the same. In a past episode, I mentioned that 2 grizzly bears in Montana tested positive for bird flu, and more mammals are beginning to be reported contracting the bird flu. So a little update on the numbers. You can go to this website and it shows an up-to-date tally on all the bird flu numbers, both in wild birds and domestics, but it has a separate section for mammals, and it's compiled by the USDA APHIS. I used to work for APHIS, and it was really fun to tell people that you work for the United States Department of Agriculture, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, Plant Protection, and Quarantine. The government and their acronyms. Fun fact of the day. Anyway, you can see all of the numbers and all of the different species that it includes, which now has a leopard, tiger, dolphin, seals, skunks, raccoons, fisher, bobcat, a lot of foxes, and a bunch of other things. So, interesting to see how it's spreading among species. So far, though, there's still just 1 case of bird flu in humans so far. Last week, I mentioned that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will decide within the year whether or not to delist grizzly bears. So for this week's deeper dive, we have Randy to give us the lowdown. Fish and Wildlife Service just announced the 12-month status review. So basically, in the next year, they're going to decide whether or not they're going to delist grizzly bears within 2 populations. Basically, the stuff around Yellowstone and Glacier, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And that's like the simple way of putting it.
Yep. Because there's 5 distinct population segments, and those are 2 of them, 2 separate ones.
Yeah, and Randy's been involved with this, so he's going to give us the lowdown of what all of this really means. Because you've been involved in talking with people in the know and have just personally been involved for years.
Right. In 1999, 2000, 2001, I was one of 5 Montanans who sat on the governor's grizzly bear roundtable, and we worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to craft the conservation strategy for delisting of the greater Yellowstone grizzly bears. I learned more about grizzly bears and more about the ESA in those quarterly 2-day meetings than it was like a crash course in the ESA. So,
yeah. And so I think myself included, but a lot of us, I feel like, and you guys speak up if you feel this way, like, sweet, delisting grizzly bears. We're going to go hunting grizzly bears next year.
Yeah. And this is where I end up being. I feel like I'm the bearer of bad news or throwing a wet towel on a survival fire, because people conflate the two. That delisting means hunting, and it doesn't. Delisting is its own step, its own mechanisms, and you have to meet these criteria that say this population is no longer threatened or endangered, and its survival is, And it's not like someone makes that as an arbitrary decision. There's population goals, there's habitat criteria, there's, in the case of grizzly bears, there's what's called the primary conservation area, there's a designated monitoring area. outside that. So there's a ton of safety nets in there. It's a very complicated thing, and I would suggest anybody who is interested in this topic go read the conservation strategies for each of the 5 population segments.
And that would be on the U.S.
Fish and Wildlife Service website. Gotcha. They have what those are. Now, the Bitterroot doesn't even have any bears. A bear occasionally goes through there. That's one of the 5 areas. So there's really not even a discussion around that. There's the Northern Cascades in Washington. There's really not a discussion on that because occasionally a grizzly bear goes through there. The 3 robust populations are the Greater Yellowstone, then the one they call the Northern Continental Divide population, which is Glacier.
Yep.
And then there's the Cabinet Yaak, Selkirk area.
Okay.
So those are the only 3 areas that really have much in the way of grizzly bears to talk about. Now, what's been hitting the news is the governors of Montana and Idaho and Wyoming have petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to look at this and say, hey, you can't continue to punt the ball all the time. And so that's what's happening right now. They're gonna embark on that, and we do know they're gonna get litigated. That's it. That's one guarantee.
Right.
Know?
Well, so Montana and Wyoming's petitions are essentially being listened to, but they already denied looking at Idaho's, if I'm not mistaken. Right.
I believe. Yeah, Idaho is the portions of Idaho are very, very small that have populations.
Right. And I think in their petition, they requested that grizzlies be delisted in the entire lower 48 was part of. And so the governor already announced that he's going to sue the the federal government. So I don't know. Yeah. I mean, is there anything that's going to come of that?
That's a whole lot of posturing, and I get the frustration. But if you look at the ESA and the steps that you have to go through to prove this population is no longer threatened and endangered, it looks at, okay, when we hand this off to the state, what are their management plans? What are their statutes? What is their, what safety nets are the states going to provide? Mm-hmm. And so you can sue people and say, well, this is what I want. But if you don't meet all the criteria, the odds are you're probably not going to win. And I mean, right now, this is kind of interesting, right? Martha Williams, who is the former Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks director, is now the director or the leader of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Right. So she's aware of how the state agency, at least within Montana, operates, and they're kind of what they're thinking.
Yeah. And she has written a letter to her successor, Director Hank Warsich, saying, hey, there's a bill right now in the Montana legislature that if it passes, it's going to make it so we can't check that box to give you management authority. Because you get legislators tweaking and messing around with this stuff, and they have no understanding of this process. And
that's what the title of Andrew McKean's article was: Montana legislators don't blow our best chance to delist grizzly bears.
Exactly. So you get a legislator who says we want to kill. What it is they want to allow ranchers to kill grizzly bears without much sideboard to it, and that's not part of what Montana represented to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of our conservation strategy. That the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they gave some feedback and comments. And so we said, here's how we're going to protect grizzly bears. Hunting is going to be part of it, but we're not going to let people just go and shoot them for the hell of it. Well, this new bill, the way it's worded is like, so you get these legislators gumming up the works, kind of like on everything, right? And so McKean's article is right on target. If the Montana legislature wants to screw with this stuff, our chance for delisting is just going out the window. And people can be frustrated, right? Oh, we got too many of them. Okay. We have way more than we promised we would have. So let's go through these steps and make sure we get management authority at the state level.
Right.
That's the goal for everybody. That's the reason I spent 3 years of my time every quarter for 2 days, going around the 3 states of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming doing that crap. I want state authority over grizzly bears.
So that's what the whole delisting allows the state to do, is to take control of the
management authority. So in its simplest terms, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service evaluates and says, yeah, we have more than what we said in terms of numbers. Their expansion and their population across a larger landscape. Okay, we've met that. And I'm simplifying here. The habitat criteria is, okay, they're not going to go put another ski resort in another Big Sky or Jackson in the middle of the primary core area for grizzly bears. Mm-hmm. And so if they can check all those boxes, they don't have any choice but to hand management authority over to the state.
Right.
Now, they've done that, and they've been sued many times.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's like there's a lot of parallels to the wolf delisting as well. I mean, it seems like it's a constant moving of the goalpost, I guess.
Right.
Is what it feels like to a lot of,
Right. It feels like a moving of the goalposts because you end up with judges who do sometimes move those goalposts.
Right.
But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they view it as success if they hand something over to the states. That's why 2 or 3 times they've already petitioned to hand over the greater Yellowstone population to Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. But they get sued.
Right.
Isn't that the goal? I mean, isn't that kind of the ultimate marker of success of the Endangered Species Act?
Yeah.
Yes.
Delisting.
And it's kind of funny how some of the extreme environmental groups or animal rights groups have now viewed any delisting as this loss for them.
Right.
They're like, no, this is a success story. That is a very positive thing. If you get removed from the endangered species list,
These groups, they're the ones doing the suing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they make money doing it.
Yeah, it's pretty.
We should someday do a whole podcast on the Equal Access to Justice Act because that's the way they make money doing it. But so for people who don't understand this, the director, in this case, it would be Martha Williams. She says if she checks all the boxes, like some of her predecessors have, says, okay, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, I think you guys are okay for the greater Yellowstone population. We're going to give you management authority there. That is the person who gets sued. So it's not like they don't want to do this.
Right.
If you want to see some of the best grizzly bear biologists in the world, go sit in on grizzly bear meetings where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is there. It's the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. They got this stuff dialed. They know it, but they're the ones getting sued because they say, no, we want Montana and Idaho and Wyoming to have control.
Yeah.
And the reason...
If these criteria are met.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the past, they've said the criteria have been met. And so they've petitioned to do it. They got sued, and the judge said, no, I don't agree.
Right.
So
wasn't part of it too just like the sampling methods of estimating populations and arguments over how accurate population estimates are?
Yep.
And
and
elaborate on that.
Here's why they argue about it. So in the greater Yellowstone population, there's a certain allowed human-caused mortality. Okay, that's problem bears that get in trouble. They eat a tourist in Yellowstone, so they depopulate that. Okay, they kill that bear. They get run over by cars. Self-defense, somebody shoots one. So there's a whole pile of things that are called human-caused mortality. Hunting would be part of that pile.
Right. And there's a significant amount of human-caused mortality every year already, right?
Oh,
like in the last 10 years, there's
a
number every year.
Yeah, it's a huge number, and it can only be a certain percentage of the population and even a smaller percentage of the female portion of the population because grizzly bears have such low productivity rates. So if you think about this, if we use an old method that says, okay, there's 600 grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone region, and this many of them are females and females with cubs. So they apply those percentages to that. Well, now all the scientists are saying, we have better counting methods, better ways to report with the same confidence level what the numbers should be. But those might end up saying, we got 900 grizzly bears instead of 600. Well, those groups you're talking about, Marcus, they don't want that new, better science used because now the human-caused mortality is based on 900, not 600. So if we say, I'm going to pull a number. The total population can have 3% human-caused mortality. Well, you apply 3% to 600, that's 18 bears. If you apply 3% to 900, that's 27 bears.
Gotcha.
So now the capacity, the window, the opening for other human-caused mortality that would include hunting gets wider. Mm-hmm. And they're like, no, we don't want that. We'd rather have this old science that, yeah, it was the best at the time. But so it's this kind of stuff. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gets sued, not even for delisting, but they can get sued at times for changing those methods to better methods.
How does that even get, like, how does the judge side with them in those discussions? It just seems so bizarre.
I hope I never end up in front of a federal judge, but I'm going to tell you my opinion is they have degrees in accounting like I do as an undergrad, and then they go get a law degree and they work through the system. And accountants are not scientists and biologists, right? We like to think we know a lot, but we don't. And so they apply the ESA through their lens or their view of what they know and what they've been told. So,
yeah,
it's interesting.
So this whole discussion then has been about delisting, which Paul says that's the goal, right? I mean, if we get delisting, that should be the jump up and down, celebrate, toast to each other. Hey, guess what? We've made huge changes to how we use landscapes. We've protected habitat. We've done all these things in this humongous carnivore that requires immense amounts of wild country, still is safe and secure. If we could check that box, and we've met everything, that's cause for celebration.
I mean, wouldn't you think that politically that both sides could be very, very happy with that outcome? Right.
They could, other than the little caveat that if you read the conservation strategy for the greater Yellowstone area, and this was, I was, of the 15 roundtable members, I was the one to represent hunters. And I'm like, I am not voting for this if hunting is not an allowed management prescription when it goes to the states. And it's explicitly stated in there that management is an expected tool once we give it to the states.
Right.
So these groups that will never celebrate, they use that little sliver, that 2 paragraphs of the conservation strategy as their reason to oppose it. So,
yeah.
I mean,
when I think
delisting doesn't mean that we're going to get to hunt them because of the human-caused mortality limits.
Right.
But we aren't going to get to hunt them without delisting. So if you're a hunter and you have an interest in bears generally, like I do, I think it's cool to be able to say we've done that.
Yeah.
But for those who look at it and say, I really would like to hunt them someday, okay, you got to clear that first hurdle of delisting. Don't let legislators go mess this up. Support those U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologists and scientists who are building that data set, because they're the ones who are going to get us there. And if we don't ever clear that hurdle, the discussion about hunting them is just, whistling Dixie.
Is there a way legislatively or as a state for us to better support the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in, teaming up to reach that goal?
Yeah, we've done that until about the last 2 to 4 years in Montana. We've just buried the needle on stupid ideas. I don't know how else to say it. Yeah. I mean, every U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service director looked at Montana's grizzly bear management plan and said, that's a great plan. We're comfortable handing this off to you. You look at the crazy shit that happened in the last legislative session in 2021 and what's happening and what is proposed right now, they're about ready to shoot a big hole in the boat of Montana getting management authority of grizzly bears.
Yeah, do you think they recognize that?
What's that?
Do they recognize that they're shooting a hole in the boat?
Oh, yeah.
Or are they just like, this judge doesn't like us, so we're going to do it our own way?
No, they can go back to the bar and tell everybody, boy, I so damn son of bitches.
But I feel like the average Montanan or Wyoming or whatever, but I guess we're talking about Montana with the legislature. Mm-hmm. I think the average guy doesn't know about this and like how that's going to totally gum up the works.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if they think that, ranchers are going to get to kill problem bears easier, I'm all for that. But they don't look at the bigger picture.
Right.
But I think, it's just anecdotally, I think so many people are frustrated because if you spend time in certain parts of Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, there are very high densities of grizzlies.
Very high.
And so like you see, like I've seen it myself, like I start to see a lot of bear sign, and it's like concerning for safety, one, but also it's like, yeah, why can't we hunt these things? They're seemingly everywhere. And it's like, yeah, they don't occupy the entire historic range, but very few animals do occupy their historic range.
And
so this is frustrating, I think, especially to the average guy who's going out in these areas where they're so dense. It's just like, that they're just sick of it.
And for the person who's frustrated, learning more about it and advocating for getting us over that first hurdle is the important step. Advocating for things to snare bears, to trap bears, especially in areas where there are a lot of black bears and grizzly bears. Okay, when Montana starts messing with our black bear rules to make it so you can, shoot them. There's some pretty crazy things that passed last legislative session for black bear hunting. Well, everywhere that we have grizzly bears, there's also black bears. And you start doing those kind of things, and it has an impact on grizzly bears, like chasing bears with hounds. Okay. Right. I don't care if people do it, but it has an impact, and it changes the way that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to look at Montana's bear management and what protections we provide for grizzly bears. So when they start doing a lot of this crazy stuff, it's not like it just happens in a vacuum. If we didn't have grizzly bears on the landscape, all those things they're doing, you know what? It wouldn't affect delisting because we wouldn't have anything to delist. But the reality is we have Ursa horribilis, the grizzly bear right here that we got to deal with. So we can't say we want delisting, but then we're going to do the other things. Because the ESA has been around for 50 years now. And we know what the rules are. We know what we've signed on to. So let's do it, and let's get over that first hurdle. Let's let the lawsuits happen. Eventually, we will win those lawsuits.
Yeah. So I think the question that everyone is curious about, say everything goes perfectly according to plan, at least within this 12-month status review, and grizzly bears are delisted in those two core areas.
Yep.
How long do you think it is before there's a hunting season?
A long time. I don't think there will be hunting grizzly bears in my lifetime if I live a normal age. And now that I said that, some hunter might say, well, let's get rid of him. Let's terminate his normal age. And the reason is Montana has a plan that allows for it. Okay. If we get management authority of grizzly bears, we do have a plan that allows for hunting. Right. But it's got to fall within the confines of the human caused mortality limits. And if we're already exceeding all of those through, self-defense, problem bears, people feeding them in their bird feeders, every time we see somebody doing something stupid that results in a dead grizzly bear, that hurts our chances. It takes away that capacity, that allowance for other human-caused mortalities. So since we're already exceeding that in many years, the likelihood of us getting to hunt bears gets slimmer and slimmer.
Would you be able to make the argument that hunting bears would decrease those other ways that they're dying?
No, because it's such a small percentage. And a lot of people will say, well, if we'd hunt them, they'd have more respect for humans. No, the percentage that we would get to take in the places where the hunting would occur isn't going to...
Right. And weren't you saying that if the first steps of hunting are probably going to be on those outer fringes of their habitat, it's not going to be hunting in the core areas right away? Or that's what the management plans currently
that's what you
indicate.
That's the path I think those plans would lead to, because you have the primary conservation area, you have the demographic monitoring area, and then you have everything else outside there, which is kind of no man's land. They aren't necessarily counting those bears towards a bunch of these things. They aren't counting the mortalities towards some of these markers, but there's getting to be a lot of bears in places outside that. Mm-hmm. So if we did have hunting seasons, those bears would almost be like they didn't even exist. Gotcha. Now, the flip side of that is there's been lawsuits about genetic connectivity. And genetic connectivity are those bears that are going outside the PCA, as it's called, in the DMA. They are the wandering bears. So it's it's going to be a challenge to see how we can address those lawsuits, but they're going to happen. And we just need to brace ourselves that there's going to be lawsuits. Even if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wins all the lawsuits and Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming get management authority, the day that we issue a grizzly bear tag, expect Montana FWP to get sued. It's the way the system works. And I know it's frustrating. I get frustrated with it. I want Montana to have management authority, but it's the process we're going to have to go through.
Yeah. Yeah, and just have to follow the steps to make it happen.
Yeah.
So.
And a thing of note is an endangered species recovery plan doesn't say we got to have grizzly bears out in the Missouri breaks like when Lewis and Clark came through and that's when they first ran into them. No, the recovery plan identifies a geographic area as a core area, and recovery has to happen there to certain numbers, certain levels, certain habitat protections, and then there's like a buffer zone. And then you got to build all these safety nets of, well, what happens if a big disease comes and wipes out half the grizzly bears? What happens if a food source disappears and bears start dying? So there's a ton of safety nets there. And if you have enough safety nets and you've identified a geographic area, that's when you can start delisting if you meet all these markers. It's not, some people say, well, until their entire range is recovered, we shouldn't be delisting. Well, guess what? Where we're sitting here right now, until settlers showed up here, 160 years ago, there were probably some grizzly bears living right where this building sits, eating on some elk or some bison or something. So
I think the entire range argument falls apart pretty quick because any species, in our society today, there's too much infrastructure and just towns and whatever that it's just not feasible.
What state had the largest population of grizzly bears pre-settlement? California. So all those folks who worried about it in, LA, San Francisco, Sacramento, wherever, you better pack your bags and get the hell out and put them bears back in there.
Now you're going to have a legislator proposing a bill to load up all the bears in Montana and move them to California.
Yeah. Well, if anyone wants some extra grizzly bears, we got more than enough here. We'll ship them to you and I'll pay the freight personally, whatever the trucking costs. I said that in my seminars over in Seattle last week.
Yeah.
Because they have that northern Cascades area just has the random bear comes through from British Columbia. I said, I got a deal for you. I will pay the freight if you guys will take some of our grizzly bears.
Nice. All right. Well, we're over our 20 minutes, so I guess we're going to have to cut this short. But, it's an interesting topic. Maybe someday.
Maybe someday. And, one thing I know is if we give up and we quit and we don't keep pushing the issue, someday's never going to get here.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for watching or listening.